All right. So good morning, everybody. And so all the people go from kind of this ether space, as I said, and I'm going to just say good morning on the chat. It just usually takes a couple of minutes to get everybody over.
Okay.
And usually all my warrior participants, all the folks that have been here over and over again, usually tell me on the chat whether they can hear me okay. So if you guys can tell us good morning. It just takes a minute for everyone to kind of come over.
And are you doing these once a month or twice a month?
So we do these usually once a month.
Okay.
Yeah, and so if you have any other great suggestions of people, that's how we find a lot of really good people.
Absolutely. Yeah. Katie Lear was the person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yes. I meant to tell you. I did speak to her and I'm super excited about it. So we're actually in the process of trying to set something up. I mean, we set up a conversation, but trying to set up, what type of, topic and things like that. But I'm going to listen to her videos on coping. So I'm super excited.
I think it's such a neat idea to have coping strategies for kids as a video.
Yeah, I think it's great. And we were talking about the fact that it doesn't have to be an and or, right? Good morning, everyone. Well, as we're chatting away, if you guys want to put in the chat if you can hear us okay, that would be excellent. And we would know that you're hearing us. I know Lindsay's out there too. Yay. Okay. Good morning, Julie. Thank
Good.
you. Good morning, Elizabeth. Yay, Dee. Okay. I'm not wearing my headphones because, as I told Elisa, I accidentally forgot to charge them last night. So I think I'm just going without them today. But we were just talking about Katie and how I said, I know it's hard for a lot of practitioners now to find the room and the space to meet all the need and demand out there. But I think even, when I've worked with different therapists and, for my different children, it's still nice to also have things like the resource of those coping cards videos, because it's a nice thing for my child and I to do together.
Yeah, and to have it presented in a way that kids can learn from it is really cool too.
Yeah. I think it's really great. And if you're just joining us, we're just going to give it another minute because I know people are still signing on. I can kind of see the numbers going up, and then we'll go ahead and start. So we're excited that we had so many people signing up. I think there was almost 300 people, which just goes to show you, Elisa, another book.
There you go. Right? Yes, that would be good.
I know that Dr. McCarthy's book is close to, I guess they're wrapping things up. I guess it's going to be another year.
Is it another year? I knew it was sometime. I thought it was sooner than that.
And so we're excited. I'm vying to be hopefully the first person. Maybe we'll have to have something in person too. Get everybody
fun, right? Yeah.
And I know that there's people from all around the globe because I've gotten emails asking about time zones. So, all right. And I know that we're just getting everybody signed in, but I'm going to go ahead and start because I want to make sure that you have plenty of time. And so we're very, very excited about this morning. I know that I was out with some other moms last night. We have various age ranges, but middle school and high school. And of course, I have a college student, and we were all counting down the hours told this morning.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, I can't wait to welcome you more officially. For those who don't know the Study Pro, I am Debbie Rosen, and myself and Lindsay Toms, who's the moderator in the background here, making sure everything's going okay. We are the owners of the Study Pro. And so we're an executive function and study skills center. And I think most people know that that pertains to what you're seeing on the right and the skills that students need to be able to manage their work at school. And so what we do, of course, is help students build underdeveloped executive function and study skills. And our goal really is to help them to identify what barriers or friction they're having, and then really also embrace the idea that when you do see a barrier or friction, that you can use strategies to fill that gap. And it's very familiar, very similar, as we have talked about, Elisa, with to therapy, in that when we're working with anybody with anxiety, for example, we're really trying to help identify when and where and why that's happening, and then what can we do in terms of strategy versus eliminating it. So that's a lot of what we do. Of course, the other thing that we do is we speak, and we have speakers such as yourself today. And so we're excited about the next couple of presentations that are coming up. Yorktown High School is sponsoring or asked us to speak on reducing homework resistance, which really has a couple of parts. One is kind of the why and the when and the where of it, and giving parents a chance to think about that. Like, why is this even happening? I think sometimes we're so resistant about things and we're not sure we really understand that. So we're going to talk about that. And then what are some of the things that we can do to help reduce that friction when we're trying to work and, of course, assure our students' success. And so we did just send out an invite to that, I think last night. So if you're on this, I'm sure you are on our distribution list. There's a bit.ly here, and we'll also put the bit.ly in the chat once we get going, so you can have that. It's not on our website because it's on the Yorktown website, but we will make sure that that's also included in the resources that we sent out today. And then next month, someone who's near and dear to my heart, I'm not shy when I tell you that my son still sees Dr. Edward Spector. He is an expert in technology and technology addiction, technology use for kids. I think my son has outgrown that piece a little bit, but we did go to him when my son was, I think, like 14 or 15, just for that reason. But he's just an unbelievably coveted resource in that area, and just in helping students or adolescents, I guess, all the way around. So he's coming on the 8th of December, and we're going to be sending out an email this week on that. So with that, we're going to move it quickly into welcoming you, Elisa. And I know you've been in practice for 25 years. Let me see. I've probably known of you, or we've been somewhat related for, 18 of those, because I think my son started going down the hall probably 17 or 18 years ago. And, your reputation precedes you. I know that everyone will see that today. And obviously, not only do you work actively with kids around CBT, but you help the rest of the community and the rest of, other practitioners and students learn about CBT. And so we're really excited about everything you have to share today. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Okay.
And then letting you go ahead and put your slides up so that you can control that. But for everybody, while she's doing that, just so that you know, thank you for sharing that you can't hear. If you can't hear anything for some reason, please do log out and log back in and try to refresh your screen. And then this will be recorded. It's being recorded right now, and we will send out the link to everybody right after the presentation. And so, Lisa, I just wanted to welcome you again, and I'm going to put myself on mute. And if there are questions that come up, everybody put them in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and take note of them. And if there is a time to interrupt, we will. And if not, we'll catch them at the end.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Study Pro is kind of an amazing resource in our community, and I've had kids do it for years. So today I'm going to talk about the teen brain and how the developmental changes affect adolescents and what we as parents can do about it. And so it's looking at kind of what happens, but also a little bit on what we can do to help them kind of get through this period. So we're going to look at development of the brain, and it's not going to be like an in-depth thing where we have to talk about all the complexities. We're going to look at the kind of general ideas of what's happening in the brain, why emotions are so big, and why that's also not teens' fault, but how we can help them with that. The risk that comes with being a teenager, and a lot of that has to do with pleasure seeking and the reinforcement from our brains, from your brain at that time, the role of peers, because they play a much bigger role in adolescence, as we know, and that is reinforced chemically in the brain. I also want to make sure I talk about how amazing the teen brain is, because that's the part that I think is easy to forget as we get into how hard it is to be with teens. And I wrote this book while I was living with my 3 teens during the pandemic. So there were a lot of intense moments. but there still is just a wonder about the teen brain. And if we think about big movements in time, like Vietnam, or even some of the things that happened with Parkview in Florida, teens often are the ones who are leading big moments and creating social change. And that is because of the excitement and activity of their brain and the passion. So the parts that are tricky exist, but if we can channel them into really positive ways, it can be really amazing. And then I'm going to spend just a little bit of time. I'm a cognitive behavioral therapist. I'll spend a little bit of time talking about CBT strategies that could be helpful. So looking at this, I'm going to go with the 4 overlying tasks of adolescence. And these are safety, status, sexuality, and independence. Safety is, if you think about the evolutionary part of adolescence, kids, anyone was trying to break out, right? You're trying to become an adult, and we often will see kids in packs, right? Like part of being safe is being among other people. And then as that group, that pack exists, there's status within it. I mean, there's actually fascinating research on this. One study at UVA looks at status for popularity, and it finds that kids who, and I'm doing this from memory, so I hope I get the numbers right, but like 98th percentile and above in terms of popularity, like the highest, most popular kids have very low stress about their status, have a very low stress just in general about social situations. But the kids who were 82 or 83 up to 98 had the highest stress. So that idea of status is trying to fit in so badly and find your place and have a role within a group. If you get below that 83%, you get into whole different groups of kids and it becomes much less stressful. There's just this enormous pressure to be safe by being in a group and find your place in a group. Sexuality, this is getting really interesting because pre-pandemic, we already knew that kids were having less in person. I think that's kind of a weird way to say it, but kind of thinking about video and stuff. So less in-person sex. And I really wonder what we're going to see come out of the pandemic about that. But in terms of adolescence, this is a time where you are attracted to other people, where you attract other people, where you have some kind of sense of connection and arousal around peers, and independence, kind of working towards that bigger goal of independence. How am I going to be in the world? How am I going to be safe in the world? So those are our 4 tasks that we're using. And we're going to kind of have those as an overarching theme, and we'll go through the brain around them. So here are the amazing parts of the teen brain. This is, I'm going to say this is new research, but it's not that new because it was 2012. And I just feel like I'm getting old and thinking it's new. But teens can actually increase their IQ during adolescence, which is not something we used to know. When I was in grad school, none of this was taught. I mean, it was the 90s, but we didn't know these pieces. So teens can increase their IQ during adolescence, and about 30% do. 30% also lower their IQ. And that speaks to the piece here of they can change IQ because your brain is so excitable and active and open. There's all this possibility. So through effortful learning, for the kids who are really making an effort to learn, we often will see that they can they create more neural connections. But it's also a time when you're at much greater risk for drugs and alcohol because it's all about pleasure seeking and rewarding kind of things that feel good. You can also see it lower. What I was kind of devastated by is learning about how, I think we knew this, but I guess as I looked at the research on how vulnerable the teen brain really is to drinking and alcohol, it's significant. So you actually can cause changes that lower IQ, and about 30% stayed the same. So that has amazing opportunity. Of course, I also started thinking, like, when I was a teenager, if you had told me I could raise my IQ by working really hard, would I have done it? I doubt I would have cared enough because I wouldn't, so it's all complicated. So the other parts that are amazing, finding a group, like the teen brain is driven to find peers, to connect with people. And that is a really nice thing. It learns, like I just said, there's so much opportunity for learning. And it really is distinct. And this was kind of a newer thing that has come out, that it is not the child brain. It is not the adult brain. The teen brain is a unique thing that exists. And it's because of all of the changes that are occurring. And we're going to go through that. So all of our brains develop back to front, right? Most kind of basic safety parts here and the things that are just kind of core needs. And then the higher level things come up front. So if we keep that in mind, that is related to adolescent development. In terms of thinking, okay, so the limbic system, the amygdala, kind of back part of your brain, is fully formed at 8 months in utero. So a baby who is not yet born has a fully formed amygdala, which means they can react and respond to threat. But humans are the most vulnerable infants that exist, are the most vulnerable mammals, because the human birth canal is so small and babies' heads are so big. So we are prepared for threat from the start, but we lack the resources. And I think that's kind of an interesting metaphor for what we're dealing with adolescent brains. And the adolescent brain isn't complete. So I'm going to show you some pictures of what that looks like. But gray structures are gray matter is the structure, the kind of core pieces of the brain. The connections will go to these structures, the cell groups here. And the gray matter exists, but it is not wired. It is only wired to 80%, which sounds really good until you think about it. So like if a bridge is 80% finished, I probably wouldn't want to go on it. So there can be huge gaps that are because of that lack of wiring that cause real problems for kids. And this is how I imagine it, which is not at all sophisticated. So if there's a village and it's floating and all these houses are in water and you want to get from one part to another and 80% of it is connected, that's cool. You can easily get from those houses to each other, no problem. But let's say you want to get to the house that's really far away. You either have to get a boat or you have to swim or you have to do something that's enormously effortful and you may or may not have the resources for. That's what's going on in the teen brain, is sometimes you can't get to the parts you want easily or without a lot of effort. And sometimes you don't have the resources to get there. And this is what it looks like. So this was done out of UCLA. And it actually comes out of Jay Geed from NIH's work. And he really is the one who started kind of the movement to look at the teen brain. But what I added this slide because it looks at executive function. And Debbie said you guys are an audience that is well-versed in executive function. And here we're looking at the brain, and we're looking at development of executive function over time. And if you look at, so the red is going to be the least mature, the purple is fully mature. A 5-year-old and preteen brain, not so different, right? Like that part of the prefrontal cortex it's maturing, but it's very slow. Then we look at the teen brain, which again is growing, but not anywhere near purple. And the 20-year-old brain still has not reached purple. So we're seeing that the ability to think about long-term consequences and control impulses that come with that maturity still isn't even there at a 20-year-old brain. And we have pretty high expectations of kids, and they may not always have the ability to do what we think they should. This is also from the UCLA imaging studies, and it looks at, it's just a different way of showing it. You just see the change, but the change is not what you would expect for the way a teenager can function in the world. There just isn't the connectivity that we would like to see. So here's how it really looks. The little face is a person who that's the amygdala, that's the limbic system, that's kind of the emotion where we feel all the emotion. So emotion feels bigger and more intense in adolescence because it happens. We have this great response from all the chemicals that are going on. We feel it deeply, but it is not fully connected to the thinking parts in the front part of the brain. So this is obviously oversimplified. But if we are having all these emotions and we can't think them through, then we are living in a reaction rather than in the thought out, planned process that we would like and hope our kids could do. There are a lot of factors for that. One of the big ones is dopamine. And it's funny to me. I mean, dopamine is a mainstream term now. I hear it, people talk about it all the time. And dopamine, I think of as a cheerleader. So at the onset of puberty, dopamine levels really increase. They go up significantly. And so it's like Lauren Steinberg, who is at Temple, talks about the kind of 14 to 17 period of puberty as the time in your life where things feel the best, where you feel the most. It's like you will never feel this good again. And I can remember, I have very specific, vivid memories from this time, often involving music, but like that just, it was amazing. There's a flip side to that, I think we all know as well, but kids are going to be feeling things and feeling them in a really intense way. So you've got this high intense feeling. You're encouraged and motivated by this feeling, and you're rewarded for choices that feel good, which would be great if you were making good choices. But what we're going to see is with that lack of connectivity in the brain, teens don't always make choices. Often they're making choices based more on pleasure seeking than on rational thought. And they're getting rewarded for that. So abundant dopamine and a not fully connected PFC, so prefrontal cortex from part of the brain, means you have less cognitive control, less control over thoughts, actions, and what you're doing. And what does this look like? This looks like this is true. Yesterday, a kid was using Be Real, which I guess you have to take your picture whenever it comes up, and she was using Be Real in therapy. And I didn't realize what had happened until it had happened. Oh my gosh, like this over reliance on smartphones, like this always needing to share everything, always needing to check everything. What am I missing out on? The increased willingness to engage in risky behaviors because they're going to feel good. I worked with a young man who would tell me about, he had this experience driving. It was in the summer. All the windows were down. He had music on. It felt so amazing. He was speeding recklessly. And when he told me about it, it was terrifying as an adult to hear. And I immediately wanted to say, okay, well, that was dumb. Do not ever do that again. What I realized as we talked is what he was remembering was how awesome this was. And I had to find different ways to go in and talk about risk and cost benefit because it felt so good to him. And that's our kind of main danger here. Drugs, drinking, smoking, all of this feels so good. Our brain reinforces it chemically, and that's why addiction rates can be highest at this time. That's why we're most vulnerable at this time. There also is the prioritization on friends and the peer group, and this profound fear of missing out. And you know what is called FOMO. God, I feel old as I say it like that, but we all know what that's like. But for teens, it's so much worse. It's so much more significant. And we can't minimize it because they feel it in their brain in a very similar way to pain. And I'm going to talk more about that and loneliness as we move forward. So abundance of dopamine seems like a good idea at the time. I've done it a million times before. That was said to me after kids jumped in the Potomac at like night. And that's terrifying. That is a dangerous thing. But because he had done it a million times before, it was okay. It's funny. I mean, sometimes things are funny. Like a kid who during Zoom therapy, like during the pandemic, I was Zooming with all these kids. Oh, that was a whole different world. And one time this kid had 200 rubber ducks behind him. I was like, what's going on? And they were all looking at me. And he was saying, it's funny. And it was funny. And that's pretty harmless, right? If you can afford it, whatever, it's kind of funny, but it was funny. But mostly when they say it's funny, I don't think it's funny at all. And here's the one that's hardest. I think you are overreacting. It's not that big a deal, because that's when they use their logic to make us seem like we're being really nutty. And this really was just fine. And they sound pretty rational. But if you look at what's actually happening, it wasn't a good choice. And so we always have to find different ways in to change that. Okay, so we've got lots of dopamine. Serotonin is really low at the start of adolescence. So serotonin levels actually decrease in early puberty and they stay lower. And we need serotonin. I think most of us know serotonin from the SSRIs, like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Zoloft or Prozac or things like that. Serotonin helps us manage anxiety and it makes us better able to regulate our emotions. It's really important. So we've got more feeling good, more reinforcement from dopamine, less regulation. And lower serotonin in adolescence is correlated with depression, loneliness, and more stress and feelings of unhappiness. And we do see that with the onset of puberty, where we do see a higher diagnostic rate for kids of mood disorders. So low serotonin looks like, and I'm using externalizing things here, and I think I made a mistake in not also talking about the internalizing, because it looks like difficulty calming down and self-regulating. That can also be internalizing emotions, things that are harmful to yourself that you're doing, by yourself in your room. Increased aggression, irritability, and depression can also go inward, and heightened overall feelings of anxiety and stress. That's really hard. And that sounds like I'm never graduating from high school. I'm going to fail this class. Everyone hates me. I hate them. This is so unfair, and no one listens to me or hears me. And one of the things I think we all have the instinct to do is when we hear things like that, to be like, oh my gosh, are you kidding? That's not true. Of course not. But we miss the chance to validate. And the validation part here, I think, is one of the most important things we can do for our teens, so that if they're not regulating well and they're feeling this overwhelmed, they're really hurting. So first we have to say, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to listen. Can you let me know if I'm doing this enough or what I need to do differently, but really listening to what they're saying before we try to change their response. It's so easy, or at least maybe it's just for me, to be like, of course you are. But if I can do it in a way where I can just validate first, I get so much further. This period of time where we've got low serotonin, high dopamine, and incomplete connectivity makes everything feel bigger and worse than it is. And our negative thoughts and feelings get really amplified, and they're stickier. By stickier, I mean they show up in more places. Like we see them kind of hanging on and having a role beyond just that situation. They get carried over to the next. And that also can be problematic. So we've got all these things going on, and now we're going to throw in hormones. And hormones are really interesting because they've been in our bodies all along, but they only just wake up, that's not the technical term, during puberty. So you've got all these different changes already happening, and then suddenly the hormones kick in. And so it's like a hibernating bear suddenly wakes up, and you're exposed to so many more hormones than you're used to. I mean, like very high numbers. And it's like giving a little kid an espresso, or Red Bull. It's uncomfortable, it's overwhelming, and it feels very, very activating. So when that happens, the hormones trigger the changes of adolescence. There's a low tolerance in our bodies. And whereas adults, we have a hormone that helps us calm down after stressful events, that same hormone in teens actually makes them more agitated, more upset, more worried about things. Very, very uncomfortable. And it does get specific between genders, because we'll see testosterone in the amygdala. Remember, the amygdala is back here, fight or flight. They have really nice receptors in the amygdala that like testosterone, that welcome it. So we see with boys, we see increased fighting and aggression and outward behaviors. And that is literally the way their brain is wired. By the time they end adolescence, boys have 30 times more testosterone present in their bodies than they did at the start. I mean, we laugh about some of this stuff, but if you kind of think about it, what an overwhelming experience. How did we all get through this? This is a lot. This also relates with girls and estrogen and progesterone. So estrogen can be good. It helps, produce dopamine and serotonin. So the first 2 weeks of a girl's cycle may be fine, maybe better actually. But then the second and through the fourth week, we see that there is more progesterone and less estrogen, and that can actually lead to more anxiety, sadness, and irritability. So, and this is emphasized or even worse at the start of puberty, you see that cycle just going, and that's really hard too. It's really nice if you can predict it, if the kid will let you, because then we can kind of anticipate some of the changes and plan for them. That's different with every kid if they'll let us.
Elisa,
Yes.
I'm sorry. I just there was one kind of relevant question to this section, so I was going to throw it in there.
Yeah.
It's about, so increased dopamine is making them feel good, but decreased serotonin is causing depression. Are these simultaneous?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's kind of like the decreased serotonin would have the overall effect, right? That's a more kind of lasting effect. Dopamine comes in bursts, so it's reinforcing, and you feel great in that moment, but it's not going to be as lasting. Does that make sense and answer it?
Yep. No, I think that's very helpful.
Okay.
And there was another quick follow-up, and then
Yeah.
move on, is about, I know we always talk about SSRIs as our medication, but what about supplements? Are there anything that we can do in supplement form or anything that you can think of that help raise the serotonin?
That is not my area. I'm sorry. I would be, what I mean, it's a great question, and I would be really curious to know about it. I do know that exercise can help do that sometimes, which is just, I was going to say a natural high, but again, that's just, but so exercise we can see there, but I don't know the answer to the supplement.
All right. Thanks.
Are we good? Okay, so now we're on to oxytocin. So the changes of oxytocin during the teen years don't lead to risk, but they do lead to intense feelings of desire to connect and belong. And we see that in the friendship groups, like we were talking about. And we also see it in romantic connections and sometimes risky behavior within that, because you want to have connection. You want to feel like you're close to someone, and you are reinforced for doing that. I mean, it's so interesting how the brain reinforces so much that can be adaptive, but also kind of scary. Um, Risk taking for teens often occurs in groups, and that's all related. So if a teen's peer group uses drugs or alcohol, they're more likely to. Teens who commit crimes are more likely to do it in groups. Having same age peers in the car with a teen increases serious accidents. We know that from all the research on that and the rules around driver's license. And this one's wild to me, that teens who believe that their friends are sexually active, regardless of whether or not they are more likely to become sexually active. So it's this perception of what other people are doing, and that relates to that need to be in a group, that sense of status, and also this very real thing of peer pressure. If you say peer pressure to a kid, they roll their eyes at you, they laugh at you. I say this from experience, but peer pressure, we just need a different term because it's real and it truly influences kids. And what I'm going to show you in a few minutes is about how kids are less able to inhibit at this age to not do something. So if the group they are with is engaging in unsafe or risky behaviors and they don't want to do it, that's fine. But over time, the ability to stop themselves becomes harder and harder. Peer groups have a huge influence on behavior. And that there's so much that goes into that, but thinking about how teens are looking at risk and reward with logic does vary within the spectrum of adolescence, meaning 14 to 17 is different than 17 to 24. So during that 14 to 17 period, this is Lauren Steinberg at Temple again, and it's a 2007 study, which is interesting because, like I said, teens' rates of in-person, that's probably a better way to say that, but in-person sexuality is different right now than what it would have been then. But during that time, kids who had unprotected sex said it was worth the risk for the benefit of the experience. That changed as they aged and they got perspective. But it is so much, that's like such a beautiful example of how that window of time is so vulnerable because the pleasure outweighs everything else. And that was even after they were asked about it, not in the moment. As they were thinking back on it, they still said, yeah, that was worth it. So risk is really a tricky area for teens, and I think for parents, because it terrifies us, right? The part of the brain that has to do with risk is in the pleasure area. And so the pleasure area wants to feel good, and dopamine is all over the place. And dopamine is released at this time when you are even thinking about a reward. So you don't even have to be doing something. If you're just thinking about a reward, you get dopamine. The teen brain loves feeling good, and it's not good at inhibiting, it's stopping a behavior. And it's harder to inhibit overall because of what's going on. And I'll go through that in a minute. So teens are driven to seek pleasure over and over despite risk. Now, Frances Jensen, I love this book. This is like a great book, The Teenage Brain by Frances Jensen. She's a neurologist at Penn. And what she said is the chief predictor of adolescent behavior is not the perception of the risk, but the anticipation of the reward despite the risk. So it's the chief predictor of what a kid's going to do is not how they see the risk, but what they anticipate the reward might be. The reward is bigger and more important than the actual risk. So here's where we go into the inhibition part for teens and why it's hard. And this study, I think, illustrates it well. So University of Pittsburgh, and they use an fMRI. And so that's a kind of real-time MRI that shows how different parts of the brain are connecting. And the people in the study had to inhibit eye movements. They had to look away when images appeared on the screen. And teens could do this. They were just as good or capable as adults, but their brains were using different parts than the adults were. So teen brains had to use multiple areas of their brain versus adults who we used our frontal lobes, easy peasy. It was a lot more effort. So if we go back to the peer piece of those peers, the behaviors we would do with peers being different than what we would do on our own. If you think about how effortful inhibition is for teens, it would be hard to maintain not doing what everybody else is doing when you have a drive for status, when risk is not perceived the same way, and when inhibition will be harder to keep going. It makes sense, but it also is worrisome. This part kind of emphasizes that too. So this was a Dartmouth study that looked at how teens assess risk. And so if you ask me if it's safe to swim with sharks, I'm going to say no, absolutely not. It's a very bad idea. And I will have an image of a shark, and I will even be thinking about that shark for a while now. So it is not okay to swim with sharks, period. But if I ask a teen this, it takes them more time. They don't get the same mental image that I or you might have gotten. And they have to think in a different way using different parts of their brain. So it's not, is jumping off the roof a good idea? It's not an immediate no, it's a pause. And that's scary too, because it's like for us, we can't even conceive of pausing. It just doesn't make sense. And I emphasize that because if we know that that's a difference and that's not the kid's fault, it's just the way their brain is working, maybe we don't get mad when we say like, of course, that's not a good idea, which I might have done once or twice. So it's more of, okay, that's actually hard for them to not hard for them to understand. That takes a minute, and giving them the grace of that minute and giving them the respect of that minute. Just knowing that teens think through what we think of as instinctive. And this goes to logic and risk. So I guarantee you any of your children would do better than me on the SAT at this point. SAT is based on logic. Teens tend to be pretty logical, which kind of goes in the face of everything I'm saying here, right? So if they're so logical, why are all these crazy things happening? The idea is that they can think logically and they can deduce information, but they don't have the same ability to understand the risk in an emotional way and the same inhibitory abilities that we do as adults. So you can think clearly, it doesn't mean you're going to act the same. It goes back to that you feel things really strongly and you can think about other things, but combining those gets very, very challenging. So this is a script I wrote. I don't know. So here was my thought with this, was just how would I talk to my kids about this? How would I talk to a kid I worked with about it? And the first thing I would do would be to present information. But this would not be the end of it. The idea is that anytime we really want to connect with a kid, I can say this, but then the next part is the most important part, where I ask them questions about what I said and I try to relate it to them so that I get an emotional piece, because then they'll remember it differently. It's kind of shifting back the information to try and draw it out of them and have them bring in their own parts to it. So your brain is awesome. Seriously, this is what I might say to a kid. It's like ridiculously busy and working so hard, but it's also a little vulnerable. And if you understand the changes, it may be helpful. And my hope is that if you know some of the ways the changes impact you, you're going to make choices that are informed about how you want to protect and challenge your brain. Here's the first thing. Your brain wants to feel good more than anything. You may think that's a good thing. It's kind of good, but it also makes you vulnerable because you're much more likely to react to the idea of something that feels good. And if you are able to pause and use reason, which may take you a minute longer, you will be using your full brain rather than letting the dopamine make decisions for you. This will be difficult, but we both know you can do difficult things. So that's just a sample of it, but then that would lead to a bigger conversation. There was a study that I always think of where if you tell a teen, if you look at influence of advertising on teens, it's significant. But if you let teens know that the advertisers are trying to scam them, it changes everything and they don't believe it in the same way. So it's kind of like I want them to challenge me, and I also want to have a conversation about it where they bring in their own pieces and understand it. I just need an entry. And this was my attempt at an entry. So then moving into peers. And again, as I said at the start, there's a lot of evolutionary drive to survive at this age and to become independent. And in order to do that, you often do need a group. You do need other people. So peers matter more because they provide safety. Um, I went to 7-Eleven the other day to buy a $2 billion lottery ticket, which I did not win. And as I was walking to 7-Eleven, there was this pack of middle schoolers from the school nearby, and they're walking towards 7-Eleven, and I'm like walking faster, and they're walking faster. And eventually I actually got in ahead of them, which felt pretty good. But I was thinking about it, it was like a pack of them coming towards us. They like teens like to be in big groups. It feels safer. And then again, about negotiating that status. Then we get into the fear of missing out and stress and loneliness. And in a minute, I'm going to talk about that because that is truly painful at this age. So peers matter more for a lot of good reasons. If this is one of my favorite studies, if you look at kind of the cost of standing out and not being a part of a group, that matters too. So here, these are wildebeest. And in the study, I don't think their horns looked the way I made them look, but in the study, they had juvenile wildebeest and they painted the horns of a couple of them. And the hyenas were more likely to go after the painted horn hyenas than the non-painted horns. It is dangerous to stand out at this age, and teens know that very well. If you stand out and your whole group stands out, that's okay. But you don't want to be the one standing out alone on the savannah. So looking at this idea of rejection feeling different, this was a study that they did, and it was a program where kids were playing a game and they were playing with somebody else, and then it looked like the person left them and was playing with a third party. It was all programmed. But what they found using functional MRIs was that the rejection for a teen was much higher than it would be for an adult, and that it involved more areas of the brain than it would for an adult. So I can feel really sad about not being invited to a party and feel left out, but that is not a comparable experience to a teen who does not have that experience. And most of the teens I know are constantly scrolling and looking at all of the things they're left out, and that is stressful and that is painful. And that's something I would really like to be working on with kids because it feels a lot different. So what does help? One close friend. This is like, there's so many studies on this that I wouldn't even list them all. And this is something I do think parents can help with. Can't make your kid have friends, but if you have a kid who is really struggling, you can help. Try and find ways to connect to one close friend, even if it's inconvenient, even if it's hard to find. There are ways to do it, but there are significant protective factors in having one reciprocated friendship in adolescence. And in fact, if you kind of think back on your memories of when you were really sad during adolescence, it's usually there was a friend that you were sharing experiences with, that you felt close with. That can be enormously helpful. So if things are tough, don't underestimate the power of one close friend. And I would go out of my way to support friendships when, even if it is inconvenient, to make sure that kid has access. So now we're moving into stress and the teen brain. And these are all related to the emotionality and the kind of excitability of it. So teens do have higher cortisol, stress hormone, than adults, and girls have even more than boys. And chronic stress in adolescence can actually impact memory and learning in a very real way. And cortisol is tied to negative emotions because we're more reactive. If our cortisol is increased, we're going to be on the lookout for danger. We're in that kind of state of arousal and we're looking for things, and we become more likely to experience negative emotions and react in a way we don't love. The ACEs, so this is the Kaiser's study on adverse child experiences. So trauma can lead to less gray matter. Remember, gray matter was the houses, the actual structures. Trauma can lead to less gray matter and reduced activity in the frontal cortex. So we already had kind of a hard time with that connection. Trauma can make that much harder. And again, the piece about the hormone that helps us, not helping teens and actually making it worse. Loneliness causes stress in teens, and it causes clinical levels of stress that can lead to all kinds of problems. And we are in a period of time where our teens are at the highest rate of loneliness that has been reported. And that is concerning as a therapist, as a parent, as a person in this community. The pandemic was really, really hard on kids. As a person, my practice is focused on anxiety, and I've been overwhelmed by how I watched my anxious kids move into depression in a way that they hadn't over other times of my practice. This has been a really, really hard time. So stress impacts learning. I'm sure you guys know this at Study Pro. If I am a rat and I'm trying to learn a maze, because that, in studies, they're always making rats learn things. If I put a cat in front of the rat's cage, I'm not going to learn. It is too stressed. Its brain is too in the limbic system and arousal, and it is unable to take in new information. So if we have too much stress on kids, they do not learn. And so this gets into a whole new idea on stress. Kelly McGonigal wrote this book called The Upside of Stress. And one of the things that came out of this is, what if we're just kind of misunderstanding stress? So if I'm a rat and a cat is in front of my cage, that is very real stress. I could die. That would be awful. But we also in our culture have started talking about stress in a really kind of negative way. Not that stress is great, but stress is always going to be there. And we've almost turned it into something that has to be avoided at all costs. And I'm not sure that's great either. So in her book, Kelly McGonigal's book, she talks about Aaliyah Crum, who I think is at Columbia, a researcher. And she has this idea of like, well, what if stress can be helpful? And if we can change our thoughts, can we change how we respond to stress? And that's very much CBT. And her hypothesis is, when two outcomes are possible, your expectations influence which is more likely. One of my favorite studies with her was with housekeepers, where they did not rate their job as physically exhausting or tiring, and they kind of said their health wasn't great. And so the two groups of housekeepers in different hotels, and one group was given a poster that talked about the cardio benefits and weightlifting benefits of different, kind of making a bed or vacuuming. The other group had no intervention. And then there was, I think, a psychoed course provided. And at the end of that study, the housekeepers who were in the group that just learned a little bit about how it helped cardio and how it was actually helping them, they had lost weight, they had lowered their blood pressure, they had gained muscle mass just from, maybe they kind of changed how they were acting a little bit, but it all started with changing their thoughts. And that's where, if we can look at that kind of thing with kids, that would be very helpful. The idea is the effect you expect is often the effect you get. And this comes out of Dr. Crum's research. And you see this over and over, that expectation with stress really plays a big role. So if I think stress is going to help me, I will be more productive. I will feel happier. I have more energy. It's more like, oh, I can use this stress. And I have greater confidence to be able to deal with challenges. And people who think stress is harmful often feel like, I can't deal with this. This is too much. And they avoid and they drink or eat or do different things to try and not feel it and put things off, which makes everything worse, right? Which we all do anyway. But at some point, it always kind of just builds up and builds up. And that's the problem, because if we let stress build up so much, it becomes the cat outside of the rat's cage. We want to catch it before it gets to that point. So there's still a way to manage it. And with teens, this is especially important because of the brain vulnerability. Stress perception has really changed in our country. So right now, this was 2019, it was right before the pandemic, 85% of Americans said that stress had a really negative impact on their life, and that they had a high stress level, even if they really didn't. And that's not to minimize that some people have really unhealthy levels of stress. That is real. But in 2007, APA, which is the American Psychological Association, found that at that time, having a moderate amount of stress was great. That was really helpful. That was what we wanted. But now, or 2019, so probably even a little worse, if we have a moderate stress level, that's seen as unhealthy. So stress became unhealthy. And this is something, I don't know, people get mad at me about it, but one of the things that I'm seeing with kids right now with teens, is this lovely focus on mental health. I'm so pleased to hear so many kids talking about their mental health and wanting to really work on things and viewing it differently. At the same time, sometimes I see that the view of preserving mental health is avoiding discomfort or avoiding stress. And that worries me, because so much of positive mental health is about being able to be uncomfortable and get through it. and about building skills of resiliency and understanding that things are not always going to be okay, but that's okay for you too. There are ways to move forward. So that's something I think about a lot. And that moves into CBT and how we would use that here. And this is kind of the quick and dirty version of some strategies. The basic idea of CBT is feelings occur. And then our thoughts in response to those feelings influence if those feelings get bigger or smaller, and our behaviors influence if they get bigger or smaller. Theoretically, you can intervene anywhere on this little triangle with thoughts or behaviors to change feelings. I tend to start with thoughts. The example I always use with kids, they all seem to have seen Finding Nemo, no matter how old, which is pretty cool. So I use Finding Nemo to explain this, and I'll talk about when Marlin, who's the dad fish, is stuck inside the whale, and he's looking for Nemo, and he's with Dory, and they can't find Nemo. And he says, "I'll never find Nemo. This is terrible. I give up." And he lies down on the whale's tongue. And his feelings are sad, hopeless. Sad and hopeless works. So if he continues to think, "I'll never find Nemo, I give up," does that make the sad and hopeless feelings bigger or smaller? It makes them bigger. If he lies down on the whale's tongue and just like totally stops swimming and gives up, does that make those feelings bigger or smaller? So if we want to, it makes them bigger. If we want to change feelings, we have to change thoughts or behaviors. And that sounds really simple. It's actually harder to do, and it takes a lot of practice, but it is so possible. So that's the basic idea of CBT. So to change feelings, you have to change your thoughts or your behaviors. In adolescence, emotions are bigger, and thoughts and behaviors are also amplified. And part of that is because, remember, we've got the limbic system. It's feeling everything so big. It's not fully connected. There's all kinds of reasons for this. So it's harder in adolescence to do this, but it's actually more important to do it at this time. So this might look like a kid sitting in a class, and the teacher says, "Okay, there's going to be a test, and it's going to count for 30% of your grade, and it's going to be in a week, and it's covering everything." And at that point, the kid just stops thinking and it's like, "Wait, what? I can't do this. No, 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 no." And their thoughts might be, "This is so unfair. She can't do this. I am going to fail. My GPA is going to drop. I'm not going to graduate." And what they might do is they might walk out of the room, because this is actually a real example, and go to the bathroom and sit on the floor and cry and ruminate. And that means just thinking over and over how awful this is, which I am always fascinated by how willing my brain is to kind of play over and over bad case scenarios, and how I almost want to do it, even knowing it's going to make things worse. It's like you're kind of fighting things when that happens. So those thoughts and those behaviors are going to make those feelings worse, but they're instinctive. And so we have to go in and try and change them. And we don't do it in the moment, we do it later. So thoughts, trying to catch thoughts is the first step. And that is automatic thoughts. We call them ants, which is, I know there's like a flying bug on top. I'm not sure what that's about. The ants are automatic negative thoughts, ANTS. And the little duck, I had to try to remember why the duck was there. It's because they're right below the surface. So automatic thoughts are thoughts that are just below the surface of our awareness, and they usually pop into our mind during an emotional event, and they reinforce our negative beliefs. So for example, I was walking at a shopping center and I tripped and I fell. An elderly woman asked if she could help me up, and I was so embarrassed, and I thought, "Oh, I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I did this again. I'm so clumsy." Automatic thoughts. I probably didn't pay much attention to those, but if I start to ask myself to notice them, I will. It's kind of that process of attending. So catching the thoughts, it's easiest to catch them in high emotion situations. And we really want them in high emotion situations, because those are going to be more reflective, getting into that pattern. And then as we change the thoughts, this is the part where we as parents can play a big role. When a kid says, "I'm never getting into college," our instinct is, "Of course you are. You're going to go wherever you want." That is not true, right? And kids know that's not true, and we know that's not true. So we don't want to change thoughts to 100% perfect. We don't want to go from all bad to all good, because that's not accurate. Not only will the kid not believe it, it's that they're just not going to accept that it won't cause change. It almost makes things feel worse at times. So we want to change thoughts to true and helpful thoughts, which might be there, "I'm never getting into college." You will get into some college. There will be a college that is a good fit for you. We don't need to lie to kids about this because they're not going to believe it anyway. We want to make them feel better, but making them feel better at this age is using honesty and reality. And that sometimes goes against our instinct as parents. This is just a little tool we use in CBT, which is a practice. And it's part of CBT is that we can do it ourselves. So this is something I might do myself if I'm having a hard day, is write down what happened, what my automatic thoughts were, how much I believe them, and what I could have done instead. And it's just a practice of getting ready to change thoughts. It's a practice of pulling my awareness back to, I need to change my thoughts. And I do this a lot with kids. This is a very standard CBT homework because we really, it's very hard. The rat can't learn if the cat is in front of the cage. We can't make changes in the moment of high emotionality. We have to do that work before and after. So this would be a tool towards doing that. And again, this is, and I know I'm taking a lot of time, but this is when the same idea of emotion being stuck, and when it's not going to the thinking parts of our brain, it really changes. And the more it stays in the limbic system, the more it gets kind of crazy. And this still happens to me as an adult. I mean, so for a teen, it's even more pronounced, where the more you think about something, the bigger and worse it becomes until it feels real. And it's just kind of, it's not rational. I haven't connected here to get to the really rational parts of it. If we can name emotion, it makes a big difference. This is a study also at UCLA with Michelle Krasky, who's a big CBT person, where the goal was you had to be able to touch a very hairy, gross spider. And what they found was the people who used language and who named their emotions were far more likely to be able to face their fears. So if I just look at it, I'm like, ew, no, not going to help. If I look at it and I'm like, I feel really scared. Of course I feel scared. This is a spider. This is a gross spider. I feel scared and I'm going to do it anyway. That changes it. Just how I'm talking about it, and I'm building those connections. I'm swimming to the house, to use the metaphor of that initial slide. I'm going to skip this just because I'm taking so long, but Mood Meter is a great tool. This is one of my very, very favorite tools. This is an app. It costs 99 cents, and it was started by Mark Brackett at Yale. He is the director for the Center of Emotional Studies, and it doesn't look like this on your phone. What it looks like is different colors, and the colors you move within these. So there are 4 quadrants. One is high energy negative, one is high energy positive, one is low energy negative, and one is low energy positive. And it lets you figure out the degree of emotionality. So going annoyed is very different from furious. But if I don't think about my response, and my daughter leaves all this stuff out when I go down this morning, and I'm like, oh, I'm furious. But really, I mean, it wasn't that big a deal. It's a long story, but it wasn't that big a deal. And if I really thought about it, it's annoying, but I'm not furious. Furious is if somebody steals my dog. That's a terrible example, but I was just trying to think of something really outrageous. So furious is really different than annoyed. And being able to label emotions appropriately actually makes a difference. Going back to Michelle Krasky, going back to how we have to be honest about what we're experiencing. And so this app is one that I use with kids. I'll have them do it 6 times a day initially. So it's just learning to take the temperature of their emotion, what they're feeling and what they're thinking. I think it's one of the best apps out there. And this piece on perspective continuing, just we need to be able to differentiate between ranges of emotion. And that's hard to do. Teens will often say to me they don't want to lower the volume of their emotions, but they want to be able to feel them. And I'm okay with you can do whatever you want with it. I want you to have the choice, but first you have to know what you're feeling. And that's really hard. And trying to name that feeling is one of the most essential parts of being able to regulate emotions. And that's even harder with that lack of connectivity, but also even more important. And language becomes a superpower of how we do this. Language is how we get through these experiences. It's how we make meaning. It's how we interpret events. And it's like there may be one reality, but how we think about it makes a huge difference. And we have choices in how we think about it. And language is also building those connections to the frontal cortex. Like when a toddler loses it and they're yelling and screaming, it's because they don't have that language to say, I must have this cookie right now. Please let me have this cookie. Please make an exception this once. It is an emergency. Instead, it's just all feeling and rage and physicality. teens have these crazy high-level brains that are so wonderful, but that are overwhelmed with emotion in much the same way. And helping them build that language is a key part to helping them be able to work through this. Now, I have a couple more strategies in here, but I also know that I'm running out of time. How would you like me to do this, Debbie?
Well, do you want to just share the strategies quickly? And then I know that if people have to log off, they can watch the replay. And we can stay maybe for a few minutes after to answer any questions for those who want to stay. Is that
sure? Sounds good. I was cutting. Yeah. Okay. So, couple more strategies. This comes out of Jill Bolte Taylor's research. So, Jill Bolte Taylor is a neuroscientist who had a stroke, and after that, all of her research changed, and it really got interesting. So, when you initially have a stress response, which is an activation and arousal, your stress hormones turn on. Cortisol, norepinephrine, all this stuff is released. It's out of your control, but only for 90 seconds. So it's like you get this flush of chemicals into your bloodstream, and you can start to change your thoughts, like we talked about. You can start to change your behaviors, and every 90 seconds you get a redo. And maybe you're just turning down the kind of output of it. You're not turning it off, but that's great. I think the idea of knowing that you get a new chance every 90 seconds is powerful. And I've seen this really matter for kids, because it's like, okay, I screwed it up, but I can try again. So 90 seconds is key. You get to change it. And she kind of breaks it down where you notice when you're having a stressful event and you rate it. That sense of rating, furious, annoying, kind of, we have to be able to differentiate that. And you ask yourself what other emotions you're feeling in that moment. And you remember, stress is a neurological response to your perception. What is this stress telling me? Mark Brackett, who made that mood meter, also talks a lot about this, where he says, emotions are information. What is this feeling telling you? And then you just write down the stressors and you rate them, and use that for next time. These are coping cards. These are things that the idea again, if the cat is in front of the rat, they're never going to be able to calm down in that moment. But if we have strategies that we've learned ahead of time, and we don't have to learn them in that moment, they can be really helpful. So in CBT, we often will make cards the kids have to memorize when they're calm, so that they have it in their brain to be able to use. Usually people find one or two that work best for them. These are just some examples about how anxiety can exaggerate things, and that we've got to look at facts, not just the feelings. My personal favorite is, feelings are temporary. I always feel like feeling, when I feel bad, it's like, oh, it's going to be forever. Feelings are temporary. This will end. And then putting perspective on it. How much will this matter in 2 hours, in 2 weeks? That I could be uncomfortable reminding myself of that. And I think that's crucial for right now, because I don't think our kids right now are great at being uncomfortable. I can be uncomfortable and I can get through it. And that feelings lie, and they make things bigger and worse than they are. Last one is just like the behavioral ones are splashing cold water on your face, actually gives you a chance to reset. Progressive muscle relaxation, which is the one where you tighten every part of your body and a progression up to your head, tricks your brain into thinking the danger is past. Because as you're doing this kind of tightening and releasing, your brain, the threat system in your body and brain are getting calmed down. And hugging yourself, or other, the weighted blanket kind of pressure on yourself, can also be super helpful. So this is kind of what we've all been looking at here, is these changes are chemical, from the hormones, from the dopamine and serotonin. There is a developmental piece of how just the wiring is occurring. We have 20% of the connections missing. That's got to be built. That's going to take time. Risk is reinforced and encouraged at this age. It is pleasurable. It is really hard to inhibit behavior. Not a kid's choice or fault. It's just hard. And teens don't learn from mistakes the same way that we do as adults. But there are some really great parts too. There's a drive towards independence, towards making meaning. There's great logic. There's wanting to connect, and ability to change, and this lovely sense of adventure and excitement that go with the teen brain. And that's it. Sorry to go long.
No, that's okay. It was a lot of fascinating information. I think we all need to just give ourselves a big hug.
Too much.
I know the weighted blanket works, because not only do we use them here sometimes, but
you do.
Yes, but when my dog sits on my lap, I feel like it's the same type
yes,
of thing. So
right?
I get huge shot of dopamine or whatever that is, so serotonin. But thank you, Jennifer, saying that was wonderful. We all agree. I know that some people have to log off, so I'm going to go ahead and invite people if they do have to go. And thank you, Elisa. However, I know there were also some questions.
Yeah.
I wanted to share. I know that we had a question. Is it possible to teach teens delayed reward when technology and social media constantly feel like an instant reward? And I know we all have that question, like how do we combat that instant reward?
So there was the most interesting study that just came out that said that video gamers actually inhibit more than non-video gamers because they learn that from, I don't know, I have to look at that more closely. But inhibition, what is taught is the preventive part, because it is truly a harder task for teens to do. So they have to know that about it, that they are going to struggle more with it, and have a plan in place for how they're going to slow it down. One interesting thing is you can use high emotion to do this. So if you are in the car and you have to imagine your mom in the seat next to you, you slow down. If you're in the car and you imagine a police officer, you slow down. So we can use images to try and delay responses, and it's pretty situation specific, but there are some really fun studies with that.
That's great. Thank you. And I know that you obviously have your amazing teen brain, which is on the screen right now, but there was some questions about, are there other books? I know
Yes.
you have one, and we can send links to those as well about the teenage brain.
This is my very favorite book, the Frances Jensen book, The Neurologist. I have so many books on the teen brain, it's kind of embarrassing. I would say that my favorite is the teen brain. The second thing, my second favorite would be to look at the videos of Lawrence Steinberg, who is at Temple, but he has he has like a million lectures that you can watch, and he has done such interesting work. I can send a list because I'm also thinking of other people I like. There are a lot of great resources.
Great. Okay, thank you. And so, yes, people were asking about the replay and the slides. We'll put those up. And then there was a question about, is this information shared with teens at school?
So I gave it to my kids' AP Psych teachers, and they were really excited. And I actually have had a couple teachers reach out. But no, not really. Like they learn little bits of it. Like AP Psych will go through some of this if you have that kind of standard curriculum. But I wish this is the part of, why don't kids know this? This is a user's manual. If they know this, it's so much more helpful for them. These are, again, the piece of teens are logical, rational. They can think things through. They're really good at that. If we could give more information and strategies to kids in school environments, I think it would be so helpful.
Yeah, we absolutely share that. We say we don't want to keep secrets of these things of especially the naming and emotions, the same type of thing. I mean, what you described about, the level of cortisol that spikes when they see they're going to have a paper or a test. And, the truth of the matter is that your prefrontal cortex, and your logical brain can't really work when you have those high stress situation. And so we really have to have strategies to kind of relieve ourselves of that so that we can get back into even accessing the information that we know. And so we talk about that with writing too.
Oh, you guys do? Oh, that's great. I didn't know you did. Writing is
that whole
beautiful.
circle, the whole CBT circle. If you think you're not going to be a great writer, then what's it going to do with your actions, right? And then it's going to further your beliefs. So, and your growth. And so it's the same, it's kind of like the CBT combined with,
that's great.
Growth mindset. So there are other questions that we were talking about with teens. Will teen kids with ADHD work even more differently, or is there a difference?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to see the effects are going to be amplified, right? The inhibition we already know is going to be delayed, and that's further delayed there. It is harder. So it's like the things that we're seeing here, the ADHD adds further complication.
Yeah. One of the specialists that once told me many years ago that, it's like what you might see and what you just described, but with kerosene sometimes poured on it, and sort of like the emotions and challenges and the inhibition challenges and other executive function challenges, of course, are even greater. And then, 2 or 3 years behind. So that was what we know.
Right. That kind of, I mean, when you say that, I think of that brain image with the executive function part, and 2 or 3 years behind is really, it's a lot. That's a lot.
It's a lot. And so we had some questions from earlier that I had to do with the IQ. So just to refer back to other causes of lowering IQ and other than deep learning, what what lifestyle hacks can increase IQ. So there was kind of, you said their IQ can change during this adolescent years. So
I mean, that's actually, it's an interesting one, and I'd want to look at that study before I said this. I'll give you my memory, but this is a study that was published in the journal Nature. I think experience, having experiences that are challenging, that sometimes have some risk associated, not like scary risk, but some risk where you're problem solving and you're building up resilience. So the idea is anything that is building neural connections in your brain is what we want at this age. We want to be learning in different forms. So that doesn't have to be academic, effortful learning. That can be learning about different situations, but it is actively engaging and challenging the brain.
Got it. Okay. And then there was a question with respect to sexuality. What do you make of gender variety and splintering, et cetera, that is unique to this generation? Does that impact sexual activity? And then there was a follow-up question, which I'll ask after. So.
I honestly don't know the answer to that. It is something that is increasingly, I am increasingly aware of, and is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And I'm really curious about what's going on, because there's such large number of kids who are experiencing differences within gender, and I don't fully, there are parts of it that we know statistically that's going to happen, and there are parts of it that you kind of wonder if there is something else going on in addition to that. Is that a safer way to manifest it, or a more dangerous way? I don't know the answer to that, but I am so curious about that.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of curiosity about that out there right now. And then there was a question about the videos that you mentioned. I know you said they're Lawrence Steinberg.
Yes, Lawrence Steinberg at Temple.
At Temple, okay. And so we can send the links out there. I take
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I'll send some. Yeah.
Okay. And so I think, I know, Angela, you had, there was another question here about, curious about the distinction between fitting in and being special.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think what I would break that down to in an oversimplification is special as status, right? Is finding that special role within that. But also there's the broader need as a teen to be a part of a group. So you get that need met. You're feeling like, okay, I'm in this group. How do I stand out? How do I conform, but still kind of show my uniquenesses? And parents often really worry about this idea of conformity in adolescence. And I feel less worried about it. That kind of, I must have these shoes or this, whatever. I get it, because you don't want to be the wildebeest with a painted horn. But once you get a certain level of safety, there is then that individualism, at least in our culture, that comes out where you distinguish yourself with the specialness, right? And I think that if that's done in that kind of progression, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Right. So as we wrap up here, because I think that's the end of our questions, because I know we were kind of rushing there at the end, as we are leaving this incredibly valuable presentation, Elisa, can you just share, like, I know you kind of summarized with this, but maybe a few key takeaways as us as parents. So we just digested a lot of information about, how our kids feel so much more and why they feel so much more and what's going on in their brains and how they're kind of less equipped sometimes to take things on that we think that they should or just be able to do. So if I was going home and to do anything or think about anything differently in terms of how I interact with my ninth grader tonight, what might that be? What advice would you give to?
This is something, it was such an interesting process to be writing this during the pandemic. Well, all my kids were home and we were all together so much, because it really kind of pulled that question out of what do I do differently and what do I expect of you to be able to do differently? Because I get that there are limitations, but I also see that you are a person who is functional in the world, and I do have expectations. I'm not going to say you aren't expected to do things. You don't need to be uncomfortable. And I think what I would do differently, the thing that I changed, the first thing I changed was I started thinking about, okay, this is actually awesome. I tried to do a flip in my head of like, this is a time where passion is so high, where things are so cool. How do I help kind of build that in? And for one of my kids, that ended up being like, she's now like doing all these hardcore outward bound kinds of things that terrify me. Like finding experiences that feel safe, but also that really ignite passion in kids. Bill Stixrud, in his first book, talks about this, like, what is it that excites your kid and how do you facilitate that? I think he built a baseball field court in his backyard, something for one of his kids. Like, how do we facilitate passion and excitement? So that's one. But then two is, I really tried to check myself on my automatic negative reactions when they were just snapping at me. If I could pause and go at it a different way rather than my instinctive, because I said that, which I really like doing. I still believe in authority for parents, but I think there's probably a way to go in the back door rather than shutting the door in somebody's face. Does that make sense?
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. You know, one of the things we're talking with parents about all the time is that the only person we can control is ourselves. And so there's got to be obviously boundaries, and it's really critically important that we do have, as you said, authority as parents. And at the same time, we don't have to react to everything, and we have to see what the need is behind the behavior. And sometimes when we don't react, we give our kids the space to share things with us that they might not have otherwise, right? And
Oh,
so,
100%. But it's so hard. It's
but
so hard not to react.
it's so hard not to react. So maybe we'll use some of these skills of, there was a whole study that just came out today about meditation being as, I guess, clinically relevant in terms of lowering stress as SSRI. So
No.
yeah, I was going to send it to you because I was like,
Please do.
interesting. But with that, I want to thank everybody for spending the extra time, for those who are still out there and everybody's listening to this on the recording. We're sorry about there was some people that had some issues hearing, but of course it's all being recorded. So we'll share that with everyone and all the great resources that Elisa.
Yeah, I'll send you some.
Yep. And we really appreciate it. So we hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your week. And Elisa, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. This was fun. Sorry to overwhelm you.
No, you're
I got
great.
excited with it all.
It was really excellent information. So we're going to all go back and watch it again.
Oh,
Thank you so much,
thank you.
everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye. Lots of thank yous coming in.
Oh.